Welcome to the broadcast for Blender Basics Part 5. This is Apollos transmitting from the Blender Underground at BlenderUnderground.com, and the man again is thwarted. We're at broadcast depth transmitting our pirate signal for Part 5 of the Blender Basics series, and things are beginning to get serious. In this, the next installment of our broadcast, we will be getting under the hood of Blender's Materials panel. Now this is a deep and complex subject, and we've done our best to make it accessible to the beginner. But let this be known, Blender's materials are not for the faint of heart, and you'll want to practice and apply the lessons that we present here today. Don't get discouraged. The surest way to fail this subject is never attempting to master it. This tutorial will not cover every aspect of every material option, but will attempt to give some explanation of most of them and spend some serious time explaining the more prominent and important features. In this segment, we'll use a couple of custom blend files as a learning aid. These are not necessary to follow along, but if you want to check them out anyway, you can find them at BlenderUnderground.com in the post that introduces this installment of the series. Okay, we have a lot of material to cover in this tutorial, so we're going to pick up the pace a little bit. Fire up Blender and let's get started. We're now using version 2.45, available for download at blender.org. Shaders are a core component of most every material you will apply to a model. If we take a look at the material for the default cube, you'll notice the familiar Shaders panel, with shaders for two separate components of simulating light: diffuse shaders and specular shaders. Shaders in Blender are coded algorithms that determine how lights in the scene interact with the surface of an object. Lighting and materials interact very closely through the diffuse and specular shaders. This is why a discussion of lighting is important to a materials tutorial. Let's get rid of this default cube and replace it with a UV sphere. And I'm going to relink the material to the sphere. I'm going to change the color to red. From the editing panel, I'm going to activate Set Smooth. And I'm going to change our viewport shading mode to shaded. And this will let us see this light's interaction with the diffuse and specular shaders. Now looking at the sphere, there are two properties at work for how light is interacting with the surface. The diffuse shader determines how the color is illuminated by the lights. The specular shader is responsible for this bright spot of simulated reflection. Blender's diffuse and specular shaders are responsible for this interaction, and we can clearly see the red color reflection that results from the diffuse shader and the reflective spot, which is the product of the specular shader. And if we move our light around, we can see that update real time in the viewport. Blender uses surface and vertex normals to help it calculate lighting. We can see these on the sphere by tabbing into Edit mode and turning on Draw Normals from the Mesh Tool 1 panel. What we see here on the sphere are surface normals, lines which are perpendicular to the angle of the face. We can also activate vertex normals, which show the normals of the vertices instead of the faces. Here in the 3D viewport, lighting is calculated on a per vertex basis. These vertex normals help determine how bright the light should be at each vertex. When lighting is calculated, the light's angle in relation to the normals help provide this information to the renderer. This is why you get ugly artifacts if you have flipped normals. When lighting is calculated on flipped normals, they are facing away from the light. The interpolation of normals calculated in one direction with normals in the other cause the dark lines. If I grab a few of these verts and flip them, and I'll use Control-Shift-N to recalculate normals inside, you can see the resulting lighting artifacts. You can also see the normals pointing in the wrong direction. To fix this, I'll select everything and hit Control-N, recalculate normals outside. Okay, let's grab a look at a demo file I prepared to illustrate how diffuse shaders look. You can download this file from BlenderUnderground.com. Now in this scene I have a plane, I have a light, and of course the camera. The light has its specular property turned off, and I did that by just turning on the No Specular button down here in the shading panel. Now, as I drag this lamp around, notice the diffuse shading on the plane is changing, simulating the lighting effects. As I drag the light upward, the plane gets brighter. And as I drag the light lower, the plane gets darker, all the way to black. This is because the diffuse shader uses not just the intensity of the light to calculate brightness of shading, it uses the angle of the lamp itself in relation to the surface of the plane to determine the lamp's effect. Here we have a very low angle, so there's absolutely no lighting on the plane. If I place the lamp directly above the plane, where we have a very high angle, it's very bright. It receives the full effect of the lamp. I've scripted a little demonstration of this effect for those interested in some of the more technical details. These rods here show the angle of the surface of the plane, the angle of the normal of the plane, and the angle of the lamp in relation to the surface. Lighting calculations use the surface normal to determine the angle. As we drag the lamp around, notice the angle changes, and so does the intensity of the lighting on the surface. The angle is used to calculate something called a dot product, which is a number that ranges from 0 to 1 and acts as a multiplier for the lamp's intensity. Right now, my lamp's energy setting is at 1. As the angle of the light changes in relation to the surface, so does the dot product. And you can see that number down here. So at somewhere around 45 degrees, the dot product is about 0.5, so my lamp's energy setting, which is normally 1, is only affecting the surface at about half. With the lamp lowered all the way to 0 degrees, the dot product is 0. Our lamp's energy setting of 1.0 multiplied by the dot product, 0, is 0. So we see no lighting effect on our surface. Now this may not be the exact algorithm Blender uses, but it's close enough for us to understand the interaction. There's something else that diffuse shaders take into account when calculating lighting: the distance of the lamp from the surface. Now looking at my light's distance value, it's set to 100. The tooltip for this setting tells us that it sets the distance value at which the light intensity is half. We can understand this as a fall-off effect. As our light gets farther away from the surface, it gets dimmer. The diffuse shader reduces the intensity of the lamps depending on their distance from the surface, as well as their angle to the surface, as we already looked at. I'll lower my distance to something like 10 to make the effect more obvious. And I'll turn on this little distance widget that I scripted. Now the tooltip states that at the specified distance, the light intensity is about half. So if we set it at the distance there, we can understand this as being half of the specified energy setting of 1.0, or effectively 0.5. As we move the lamp further out, the intensity falls off or becomes dimmer. And as we move it closer, it becomes brighter. So you should be aware that the diffuse shader is considering the distance of the light as well as its angle to the surface. And understand that it's the diffuse shader of the material itself that determines how the light interacts. Now there's something else I want to make you aware of in regards to lighting. Notice that as we move the lamp even closer to the surface, it starts to get darker. Now this seems counterintuitive, as we would expect the light to continue to brighten as it's brought closer. What's going on? Well, first understand that lighting in the viewport is done on a per vertex basis, as opposed to rendering, which is done on a per pixel basis. The vertices of the plane are on the corners here, and there's 4 of them. As we lower the lamp, the angle of the lamp in relation to those 4 vertices lowers, and so they all get darker. Here's something to help illustrate. Notice that as the lamp raises and lowers, its angle in relation to those 4 corners changes. So the surface gets brighter and darker. As it raises, the angle goes up, and the surface gets brighter because those 4 vertices. And as we lower it, the angle gets lower, and so it gets darker. Let's add some vertices to the mix and see the effect. I'll select our plane and tab into edit mode. Now I've turned on the option to draw vertex normals, so you can see these blue lines at the corners representing the normals. With all the verts selected, I'll choose W for the specials menu and subdivide. Subdivide again, and one more time. Now I'm going to change the size of these vertex normals in the editing buttons to about 0.5. This doesn't change anything in regards to the mesh. It just sets how big the blue lines are when they're drawn so that we can more easily see them. With the surface of the plane subdivided several times, we get more vertices for the lighting calculations to work with. So when we tab out of edit mode, instead of seeing a dark plane, we see a plane with a bright center. This is the result of the lamp's angle to each of the vertex normals. Let me show you what's happening. I'll turn on this other layer so that you can see a representation of the lamp's angle in relation to each of the vertex normals. Now as our lamp gets closer to the surface, the vertex normals closer to the lamp have a higher angle. And so the lighting is calculated brighter in those areas. Notice that the angles for vertices farther away from the lamp are much lower than the ones right underneath the lamp. And so those areas are darker. And so as we drag the lamp around, we get this nice spot effect. Now when we render, instead of per vertex lighting, the renderer uses per pixel lighting. So regardless of how our plane is subdivided, the per pixel angle to the lamp is calculated. And you can just think of this as having one of these little reeds for each pixel on the plane when it's rendered. Let's quickly look at this effect on a sphere. Now as I move the light around, you can see the little reeds following it. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can get a better look. The areas where the light is brightest is also the areas where the reeds are most perpendicular to the surface. And as we move toward the edge of the sphere, the angle gets lower and lower and lower toward the surface. If I enter edit mode for the sphere, you can see again the difference in angle between the reeds and the normals at these areas outside where it's darkest. You can see that the angle between the reed pointing at the light, representing the angle of the light to the surface, to the normal here is pretty great. And so just like on our plane, those areas are darkly lit. These areas here, where the reeds are most perpendicular to the surface, or the light is most perpendicular to the surface, there's very little angle difference between the light and the surface normal, or the vertex normal. And those are the areas that are lit the brightest. Now going back to our plane for just a minute, if we turn on specular shading for the lamp, we get an additional lighting effect, namely a simulated light source reflection. And you can see that represented off to the left here. Now you'll notice this property in real objects, especially those with smooth surfaces. In this case, it's not just the angle of the lamp that matters, but the angle of the camera. As the camera angle changes in relation to the lamp, that specular highlight area is going to change too. And you can see it there on the render. Like any reflection, it changes with the angle it's viewed at, and as you move either the lamp or the camera, the position of that specular reflection is going to change. The primary way to affect the appearance of the specular reflection, as opposed to the diffuse shader, is to make changes to the specular shader itself. So let's take a closer look at shaders in the Shaders panel. Alright, let's get rid of the default cube and replace it with a sphere. And let's just relink the default material. I'm also going to set up Blender so that it renders to the image editor instead of to a separate window. And here's what I'll do. From the scene panel, I'm going to change the render display selector to be the image editor. Now I'm going to render the scene so that we have a render result in the buffer. And now we can change this to render to an image editor of our choice rather than having it take over our 3D viewport. So I'm going to change this to the image editor, and from this selector I'm going to choose render result. And now every time we render, it'll render to that pane. Okay, and in the materials context, I'm going to split the view so that we can see the material preview at all times. And that'll work no matter how we scroll these buttons. It'll always be visible. And that's a nice little tip I got from the Blender Underground forums. I'll also just get rid of this header since we don't need it. Zoom in a little bit here. Okay, the material preview here gives us a pretty good approximation of what our material will look like when it's rendered. And it allows us to select various primitives to view our material on, such as our flat plane, a sphere, a cube, Suzanne. We also have hair strands in case you're working on hair, and this sphere with a sky background. Now this button down here turns on oversampling, also known as anti-aliasing, and it'll slow down your render preview just a little bit, but if you have a fast enough computer you probably won't even notice. Okay, I'm going to make some final adjustments here. I want to set up our camera so that it's zoomed a little tighter to our sphere there. And let's set smooth on that. I'm also going to turn down the specular value here for the specular shader so we can just focus on the diffuse. Now we could have also just turned off specular in the light, but we'll leave it here. Now let's examine these shader types. Here in the diffuse shader selector, which is the top one here, we have 5 choices. We have Lambert, which is the default, Oren Nair, Toon, Miniert, and Fresnel. It looks like Fresnel, but it's actually pronounced Fresnel. Feel free to pronounce it any way you want. And we'll look at those in order from bottom to top, starting with the default Lambert. Okay, let's change our diffuse color to something like red, just to make it a little easier to see. Now once again, Lambert is the default shader, and it's a good general purpose diffuse shader. The reflection slider determines how much reflectivity the material has in regards to diffuse color. Don't confuse this with ray mirror reflection. This is simply how bright the diffuse color is in response to lighting. And if we raise this value, our object gets brighter, and if we lower the value, the object gets darker, simulating less light reflection. We'll set it to 0.8, which is the default and a good all-around value. Okay, with Oren Nair, in addition to the reflectivity slider, there's a roughness slider. With a higher roughness value, this shader will scatter the diffuse lighting, making the shader less hot toward the light direction. With a low roughness value, a hot spot shows where the light is most perpendicular to the surface. This is a little easier to see if we switch the preview to sphere. And you can see that hot spot there in the direction of the lighting. If we raise the value more, that light gets scattered to the elimination of any type of hot spot on the diffuse shader at all. The lighting gets evenly scattered along the surface, and we render that. We can see that result here. You really can see no hot spot in the lighting. You can't tell the light direction at all with a high roughness value, where with a low roughness value it shows up pretty readily. With a roughness value of 0, the Oren Nair shader looks pretty much exactly like the Lambert shader. Okay, the Toon shader is designed to mimic the style of cartoon cell shading to some degree, with these very prominent boundaries between lit and unlit areas of the surface, along with even lighting for both lit and unlit areas. You'll notice no color gradation or shading gradation in either the lit or the unlit areas. In addition to the reflectivity slider, there's a size slider, which determines the influence of lit areas over unlit. So if we raise this up a little bit, our lit areas grow and our shaded areas shrink. And then we have smoothness, which smooths out the boundary between lit and unlit areas there. This shader is often used in combination with edge rendering, available in the output panel of the scene context. Okay, now the Miniert shader, and I'm not even sure I'm saying that right, but we're just going to go with it. Here at Blender Underground, we just kind of go with stuff. The Miniert shader is a variation on the Lambert shader with this slider for darkness. With the dark slider set to 1.0, it looks just like the Lambert shader. With a dark setting greater than 0, it'll darken the shader toward the view direction. And if I raise this up, you can see that in the preview. This represents the view direction. We're looking straight at it, and it's darkened toward the center. Now, we can also see this in the viewport. And I'm going to change the mode to shaded. Jump out of camera mode there. And I'm going to rotate the camera around the Z-axis there, and look how that dark spot just follows it. So wherever the camera is looking from, that Miniert darkness is going to be facing right toward it. More exactly, whichever normals of the surface of the sphere are facing toward the camera, those are going to be darker. So on a more complex model like Suzanne, and we can see that here in the preview, you're going to get darkness on the surface wherever the normals of the surface are facing the view direction or facing the camera. And you can get some interesting soft or velvety effects with this shader, and that's exactly what it's good for. Now if we move the dark slider in the other direction, it'll brighten the edges around the view direction. So once again, if we rotate our camera around Z, we can see that kind of following the camera. And let's render that and have a look. And you can see exactly that. Around the edges here, it's brightened up. So instead of darkening the center with that type of darkness setting, with it less than 1, it actually brightens the edges. Same net result. It's a view direction dependent shader. Okay, last but not least, the Fresnel shader there. This one works a little strangely, but understanding it will help you understand some ray tracing features that we'll look at shortly. Now, depending on the settings, this shader turns light reflection on its head. Instead of the brightest areas of the surface being the ones facing toward the light, they are those facing away from the light. And those surfaces facing toward the light are a little darker. And if we raise some of these settings here, you can see what I mean. Now in our viewport, you can see our light direction there. And those normals facing directly toward the light are the darkest, where those normals facing directly away from the light are the brightest. And if we move our light around, you can see that adjust on the fly in real time. Now some shaders, such as Miniart, have attributes geared toward the view direction, and most are geared toward the light direction. The Fresnel shader is inversely geared toward the light direction. Another way to think of it is that it deflects light away from its center and toward its edges. And that's actually a little bit how the Fresnel lens works. In addition to the reflection property, the Fresnel shader has two additional sliders, Fresnel and Factor, and you'll need a little bit of both of these in order to get any kind of effect. Fresnel determines how much of the Fresnel effect is applied, and Factor determines how much of the effect is blended in onto the surface. So it's really just a matter of fiddling with those two until you get something you like. And if you notice Suzanne here, you can see a little better representation of this. These normals facing directly at the camera or away from the camera are the brightest, and those facing directly toward the camera are the darkest. So Fresnel shader, a little strange, but we'll be working with Fresnel properties in ray tracing. Okay, let's have a look at specular shaders really quick, and I'm going to change this back to Lambert. Now here in the specular shader selector, we also have some choices to affect the look of the specular highlight on the surface of an object. Note that in all these shader types, we can set the amount of specularity through this slider here. So this slider is going to be common to all the shader types. Now, we'll start with Cook Torrance. This is a simple shader for making shiny materials, specifically plastics. And it has a hardness setting that determines how scattered the specular highlight appears. And let's add some specular here so we can see it. And you can see the spot appeared here on our sphere. And as we raise hardness, the spot gets smaller and more refined. Same thing here on Suzanne. I'll zoom this in so we can see a little better. Lowering the hardness spreads out the specular highlight. Raising the spec value makes it more intense in general. And let's render this and see what it looks like. There we have a nice, bright, somewhat hard spot on our surface there. That's our specular highlight. Now Phong is very similar to Cook Torrance. According to the Blender Wiki, this shader is more appropriate for skin and other organic surfaces. There's not much difference in a direct comparison. Okay, the Blinn specular shader adds another layer of control, this refraction value here, which helps control the intensity of the highlight. If you need a harder and sharper specular highlight, Blinn is a good choice. If we turn the hardness and refraction up pretty high, we get an almost acrylic look. If we turn it way down, it's pretty easy to produce a soft and slight highlight. And we also have a toon shader here, a toon specular, and this works very much like it does in the diffuse shader in that it produces sharp contrast and even effect. It has the same size and smoothness controls, so we can lower the size of our shader and we can raise the amount of smoothness that affects the boundary. And this shader is a complement to the toon diffuse shader. Finally, we have Ward ISO. This shader is capable of a wide range of effects through the RMS slider. And so in addition to specular, we have RMS instead of hardness here. And we can go from extremely tight highlights to very scattered ones. And so if you need an even tighter and more refined, a sharper specular reflection, for a super hard surface, this is the one to use. The Blender Wiki cites it as a good shader for metals and plastics. The material panel contains some options that determine how the material interacts with the diffuse shader, among other things. The color swatch here sets the base diffuse color for the material. We can affect the color by clicking directly on the swatch and choosing a new value with the color picker. Here in the color picker we get a number of choices for how to select our color. We can use the sample tool here, which will let us sample a color from anywhere in the Blender window. We can enter hex values directly in, right here, corresponding to RGB colors. If you design or build web pages, you're familiar with the hex representation of RGB colors. We can use the RGB color sliders here to set the component red, green, or blue values directly, or we can key normalize values directly in. The normalized values range from 0 to 1 instead of from 0 to 255. We can also use the HSV paradigm, which stands for hue, saturation, and value. Some programs call this HSL for hue, saturation, and luminance. The HSV sliders work just like the RGB ones, but it's actually much simpler just to use the HSV color selector over here. The bar at the bottom represents the hue that we want to choose, and the box above represents value or luminance on the x-axis and saturation on the y-axis. You can see the HSV sliders update as I drag this around, and the RGB sliders for that matter. The box here to the left of the HSV sliders represents our newly selected color. And the one right below it is the color that we came in with. So if we decide now that we don't want to change the color, we can just click this box and it'll revert back to where it was. Once you have your color selected, just drag your mouse outside the box and the color will update. The same applies here for the specular and the mirror color swatches. Changing the specular color will colorize the specular highlight on the material, and changing the mirror color affects the ray mirror color, which we'll deal with shortly. These RGB color sliders over here are for whichever one of these buttons is active. And these buttons below, change those sliders from RGB to HSV if you have a preference. I usually just use the color picker and ignore the sliders altogether, but they're there for your convenience. This button here, the DYN button, is merely for setting dynamics options on a per material basis. You can ignore it for the purposes of this tutorial as it won't change the appearance of the rendered materials. Let's consider these buttons at the top of the material panel. Vertex Color Light and Vertex Color Paint are options that allow you to use vertex colors as your material color. Let's take a look at Vertex Color Paint and the Vertex Paint tool. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just get rid of this cube really fast and replace it with a sphere. I'll turn the viewport to shaded mode, and I'll press V to access the Vertex Paint tool. You can also find it in the selector here. Now let me explain what vertex colors are. Vertices can store all sorts of information, including RGB color information. We already saw how they were used for lighting in the viewport. The color information stored in vertices can be used to set the material color or to augment it in some way. Vertex colors can also be used in light radiosity calculations if you happen to be using radiosity rendering. That's actually what the Vertex Color Light button is for. Now, with Vertex Paint active, we can literally paint right on the surface of our object here. Note that we're not painting pixels, we're painting vertices, which is why we get a lower resolution look. You get that jaggy kind of look, and you can see we have a vertex here and a vertex here. We tab into edit mode, that's indeed the case. Now the color information is stored in the vertices and it's interpolated across the faces from vertex to vertex. This is definitely a cool feature, although its uses are limited, especially on low resolution meshes. If you want to experiment with it, while in Vertex Paint mode, you can find a paint panel in the editing context, right here. with options for painting vertices, such as brush size. You can also press N in the 3D viewport to get a color picker and just choose your colors here. Now, once you have the colors you want, you can leave Vertex Paint mode, and in the Materials panel, let me relink our material. The Materials panel, turn on Vertex Color Paint. Now, when we update our viewport, we can see there's our Vertex colors. There's the ones we painted on with the Vertex Paint tool. So even with our material color set to something like red, like it is now, our Vertex colors have taken over because we have the Vertex Color Paint button active. We see no red whatsoever unless we actually go and paint it into the vertices. Now, with Vertex Color Light, you can still see some of the effects of our Vertex color painting. With Vertex Color Light, the colors are blended in with the base color. And if you happen to be using radiosity rendering, Vertex Color Light actually uses the Vertex color information to radiate light. The Text Face button will use the UV Editor Assign Texture as the base material for rendering. In other words, the UV texture uses the color information for the material instead of the diffuse color. If you're UV mapping and you've assigned a texture to your object's UVs, a quick way to see it in your render is to activate this button. Now, the Shadeless button disables the effect of diffuse and specular shading altogether. So if we turn that on, no more diffuse or specular shaders, no more lighting effects whatsoever. The lighting is completely ignored, and our material displays on our object as a full, bright, ungradiated color. The No Mist button causes the renderer to ignore mist values for a specific object, or rather a specific material. Now, mist settings are found in the World buttons, and you can turn it on here and you can set it up here. Now, this causes a fog-like effect for objects that are farther away from the camera, and you might want a no mist setting in your material if you got an object like a moon that you want to show up unmisted regardless of its distance from the camera. Okay, the ENV button causes the object to render transparent. This isn't like rendering see-through. If the Z-Trans button is off, objects with the ENV property set will poke holes in every object behind it, showing through to the sky color. And let me show you what I mean. We'll render that there. And notice how what we're seeing is a hole poked in the plane right through the sky color. Now keep in mind, Z-Trans has to be off, and we'll be looking at that shortly. Now the Shadow Alpha setting has a specific purpose. If you're using spot lamps with irregular shadow buffers set, this will adjust the shadow's alpha. So if our spot here is actually set up as a spot lamp, and we're using buffer shadows and we have this set to irregular, then the shadow alpha will adjust the intensity of that shadow. There you can see our shadow completely dark. And I'll adjust shadow alpha to something like 0.5. We'll render again. And it's still pretty dark. Let me try 0.1. Render again. There you can see a nice faint light shadow. And that only works for irregular shadow buffers for spot lamps. So keep that in mind. Let's take a look at the render pipeline settings in the links and pipeline panel of the materials context. These buttons determine how a material affects the rendering of the objects they are applied to. In other words, when a scene's being rendered, the state of these buttons affect major aspects of how the renderer works with the underlying object. We'll begin with a little bit about ray tracing. Now, some of these options are used for ray tracing, which is a more realistic method of rendering a scene. Ray tracing actually traces the path that light takes around and through objects, or at least it simulates that effect. It can produce shadows, mirror reflections, and transparency with refractive properties, But it's also much slower than rendering a scene without ray tracing, so you'll want to make decisions about how and when to use it based on the amount of realism or the ray tracing features desired and when they're needed. You can turn ray tracing on and off in the render panel of the scene context with this button right here. If that's not on, you won't get any ray tracing. You'll need 5 things in order for ray trace shadows to work. You'll need to enable ray tracing, as we just mentioned, in the scene context. In addition to that button, you also need the shadow button enabled right above it to allow shadow calculations at all. Any lights in your scene will need to have ray shadow enabled. This allows you to be selective about which lights can shadow cast. Incidentally, you can make a light only cast shadows and do no diffuse illumination whatsoever with this button right here. Next, you need the object's material to be traceable by selecting the traceable button in the render pipeline settings. This makes it detectable by the ray tracing engine and gives you control over which objects cast shadows. It's usually selected by default, so unless you've changed it, it should work right out of the box. Last but not least, you need the material that receives shadows to have the shadow option selected in the shaders panel, and that button's right over here. This option's also enabled by default, so you should only have to worry about it if you want to turn shadows off for a specific material. Now, this may seem complicated, but it's designed to give you choices. You can decide whether ray tracing is done at all. You can decide which lamps cast shadows. You can decide which objects cast shadows based on their material. And you can decide which objects can receive shadows, also based on their material. And don't worry, you'll get used to this concept pretty quickly with a little practice and experimentation. Okay, let's have a look at some of the other buttons in the render pipeline settings. And let's start with the shadow buffer button. Now, where the traceable button determines shadow casting for ray tracing, the shadow buff button determines shadow casting for shadow buffers. As I mentioned earlier, buffer shadows are an alternative to ray shadows. You can have buffer shadows in your scene even without ray tracing enabled, but only if you're using spot lamps. This switch lets you decide if the material can cast buffer shadows. And in order for buffer shadows to work, we'll need to turn our lamp into a spot. And instead of ray shadow, we'll turn on buffer shadow. And let's go over to the scene panel, turn off ray tracing altogether. And I'm going to turn on a ground plane here so that we can see the shadow. Now here you can clearly see we're using a spot lamp. We have the spot boundary along the outside here, and you can see this shadow cast by the cube. Now ray tracing is disabled, so this is the buffer shadow cast by the spot lamp. And one of the advantages to these is that they're faster than ray trace shadows. Now the only cast button tells the renderer not to render the object at all, but to render its shadows. So if we check that on, and then render our scene, what you see here is no object at all, but we still get the shadow. And that'll come in handy sometimes for certain material tricks. The radio button is for radiosity rendering, which allows materials to emit light. We're not covering radiosity rendering here, but if you want to experiment with it, make sure that the radiosity button is active in the scene context, right there. And for your material, you'll want to have a small amount of emit configured in the shaders panel. And of course you'll want the radio button active over here in the render pipeline settings. Okay, Z invert, we're not going to talk about that much, but we are going to take a closer look at the Z buffer shortly. Z invert basically inverts the Z buffer values and makes the material render inside out. Okay, the wire button causes only the wireframe of your object to be rendered, and you can combine this with solid rendering to produce nice renders that show your wire mesh. There's actually a good tutorial on how to do this at BlenderNewbies.com. And so if we enable wire and render, you can see that the solid faces of our object don't draw, but our wireframe draws. Okay, the full OSA button. This forces the material to render a high-quality anti-aliasing, which reduces the jagginess of edges. And those are especially noticeable at lower resolution, so if you're having problems with aliasing, you can try activating full OSA. The Strands widget allows you to tune the appearance of particle strands used for hair and fur. For instance, you might want the start and end thickness to be different for blades of grass or coarse fur than, say, for human hair, and those options can be tuned here. The Halo button causes a dramatic change in the rendering of the object, as you can see here when it's activated. And I'll turn off Wire there, and I'll turn on Suzanne in the preview. And let's see what happens when we render. Now, as you can see, instead of rendering the object itself, a halo is rendered at each of the vertex positions. This option is commonly used for particle systems since halo materials behave like particles in that they always face the camera. Now, when the halo button is active, the shaders panel changes to provide a number of options for how to render halos. You can choose to render them as rings, lines, stars. You can even get a lens flare effect. Okay, for Z transparency and Z offset, I want to talk about the Z buffer just a little bit. Now, the Z buffer tells the renderer how close or far away pixels in the scene are from the camera. And this data can be used in a variety of ways. Now, looking at our scene through our camera, and I'm going to turn off halo there, there's a slightly different coordinate system in effect. And you can see this if I change the orientation here to view and turn on the transform manipulator. Now, when the scene is rendered, X is horizontal, Y is vertical, and Z is directly at the camera. And if we change our render preview to a render window and render our scene, and if we click and hold our mouse, you can see down at the bottom corner there the Z value, and as I drag my mouse around, the Z value changes. Now, for pixels in the scene that are farther away from the camera, we get a higher Z value. And as we move closer, the Z values get lower. And you can think of this as a grayscale image, or a grayscale representation of this scene. And here's what it looks like. Now, this is actually a rendering of the Z buffer, and I've just increased the contrast some so that you can see it. You'll notice that as the pixels get closer to the camera here, they get darker, and as they get farther away, they get lighter. Now, this information is used by the renderer to determine things like Z transparency. When it makes an object transparent, it wants to know which parts of the object are in front of others and should be rendered on top, and which part of the object are behind others and should be rendered behind those polygons. Now, the Z transparency button turns on or off simple Z transparency. If you want to have objects with transparent or semi-transparent areas, you'll need to activate either Z transparency, or in the mirror trans panel, you'll need to activate ray transparency. Now, these two things are mutually exclusive. Now, in order for ray transparency to work, you need to have ray tracing enabled. You can get a lot more done with ray transparency, but it's also slower. So if you just need simple transparency, use the Z transparency button and adjust your alpha slider to adjust that transparency. And so with Z trans enabled, we can drag our alpha pretty far down, render our scene, and you can see this ghostly transparency effect. Now, you can have a low adjusted alpha setting without Z transparency being enabled, but you'll get another effect altogether. Instead of seeing through the object to the objects behind it, you'll see through all the way to sky color. And for Z offset, this value controls how a material is offset in the Z buffer. So we could actually have one object behind another, and we could change its Z offset value and actually pull it forward when it's rendered. And as we discussed earlier, the renderer uses the Z buffer to determine what order it should draw things in, which things in the scene are behind other things. And so the offset value allows us to mess with that ordering. Okay, for the ray tracing demonstration, I've set up a scene with a checkerboard background, since we're going to be looking at reflective and transparent effects. I'm also in shaded mode for the viewport, so that we can see some of the effects of our materials and lighting right in the viewport. The checkerboard background has multiple materials assigned, which we'll look at the end of the tutorial. And as you can see, I have a UV sphere object in the scene. I also have Suzanne on a separate layer. Okay, I have a standard lamp in the scene. And I also have a Hemi lamp up here with a low energy setting. And what that does is give us a nice dome-like shadowless light casting, and it brightens up our shadows a little bit here. So as you can see the checkered background back here. Without the Hemi lamp, this would all be black. And in the scene context, I've activated ray tracing. I have the 3D cursor at the center of the sphere object, and I have the pivot mode down here set to 3D cursor. So when I grab the camera and rotate on Z, it rotates around the sphere. Now, ray tracing involves the task of casting simulated rays of light around in a scene. The renderer keeps track of each ray and determines what objects the light rays hit. The properties of the material assigned to the objects tell the renderer how to draw the surface, depending on whether it's reflective or transparent or what have you. Reflective surfaces need to reflect other surfaces that are nearby, and transparent surfaces need to pass light rays through. I'm going to select our sphere and add a new material. I'll call this ray trace. I'm going to set the base color to green. And from the Mirror Trans tab, I'll turn on Ray Mirror and set the Ray Mirror value to 1.0. Let's render with F12 and see what we get. Now I've time-lapsed this render to speed things up. No, I'm not running a Cray supercomputer. And I'm going to time-lapse all the renders just to move things along pretty rapidly. Now there's some things to take note of here. Even with our base color set to green, we see no green in our render. This is because with a ray mirror value of 1, none of the base color shows through. It's 100% reflectivity. Now keep in mind, without the Hemi lamp, we'd be seeing a very dark, harsh shadow here. And having a Hemi lamp in our scene has created a nice low-level lighting effect that raises up the values of those shadows a little bit so they don't look so contrasty. Now once again, in our render, no diffuse shading, no coloring whatsoever. If we lower the ray mirror slider a little bit and render again, okay, now you'll notice we have a lot of our base color showing through, and we even have some of the diffuse shading. You can see it's kind of darker along this edge than it is along this edge here. The more we lower our ray mirror value, the more of our base color and diffuse lighting will show through, but we'll also be reducing the reflectivity. Generally, you'll want to look for a balance between these elements. Let's try something else. Instead of reducing the ray mirror value, we'll change the mirror color. So I'm going to raise ray mirror back up, and I'm going to set our mirror color here to, I don't know, something like orange. Now you can notice this effect already in the render preview down here. But I'll go ahead and render. Okay, so there you have it. We get a very shiny and very colorful reflection. Still no base color though, because our ray mirror is at 1 which is 100%. Now, in summary, the color setting is our base color, or our diffuse color. The ray mirror slider overtakes our diffuse shader the higher we set the value. And the mirror color setting will colorize the mirror effect. Setting the mirror color to white is like having no color at all. And you can see that in our render preview. Let's consider the depth setting right here next to the ray mirror slider. Now this setting controls how many times reflective surfaces bounce off each other. We've all taken a mirror and held it up to another mirror and watch how the two reflect off one another seemingly into infinity. Now I've set up a quick demo to demonstrate the depth setting. What I've done is I've modeled two mirrors and I've put the same reflective surface on both of them. I also have a camera for the demonstration. I'm going to select that and I'm going to make it active by pressing Control and numpad 0. That's going to make that the active camera. And then I'm going to select this other camera and just hide it with the H key. Now let's start out with a depth of 0 and see what happens when we render. Okay, now see if you can tell what's happening. Our camera here faces this other mirror, and this reflective mirror bounces back to reflect whatever's behind it, or whatever's in front of it rather. Now looking at our render, we can see it's reflected once, it's reflected back to the other mirror, but then it stopped reflecting altogether. So with our depth at 0, we only get a single reflection. We get one bounce basically off a one ray mirror surface. Let's try again with a depth of 1. I'll turn this up to 1 and we'll render. Okay, so this time the light bounces off the back mirror one more time, but it stops at the front one. So this mirror reflects this surface and it reflects back to this surface, but the second time there's no reflection here, and you can see that here in the render. We get a couple of bounces. The last one is non-reflective. Let's crank it up to 10 and render one more time. Okay, this time we're seeing 10 additional ray traced reflections, and it's looking very much like it would in the real world. It's bouncing back a bunch of times, and not until the 11th time here you can see the blue surface where the depth stops being calculated. Now, high depth settings can increase render time, so try and use only what you need here. Start with a lower number and crank it up if you notice problems in your render. And here's what it looks like with a little motion. Okay, now to get things back to the way they were, I'm going to unhide our camera with Alt-H. And with that selected, I'll hit Control numpad 0 to make that the active camera again. Now, let's get back to our sphere. In addition to setting the ray mirror intensity, we can set a Fresnel effect. If you remember our discussion of Fresnel when we went over diffuse shader types, the Fresnel diffuse shader deflected light away from the source direction and toward its edges. And I'll demonstrate this again quickly by changing the diffuse shader to Fresnel and cranking up the value a little bit. Notice the areas of the sphere that we'd expect to be lighter are actually darker when we consider the light source here. Normally these darker areas would be illuminated by the light, and the light would fall off as the angle of the normals moved away toward perpendicular. And tabbing into edit mode, you can see the normals of the sphere there. The ones facing the light are the ones that the Fresnel shader are actually making darker. and those that are away perpendicular to the light are the ones that are being made brighter. If we move the light, you can see the effect follow it around. The Fresnel effect and the ray mirror settings work in a similar fashion, with the exception of the camera direction or the view direction and not the light direction is what's taken into account. Now we can activate Fresnel under ray mirror and it will begin to bleed the diffuse shader through toward the camera direction. And let me show you what I mean. Back into edit mode, all of these normals that point toward the view direction will start to show diffuse color instead of ray mirror, depending on the intensity levels. And as the normals fall away to perpendicular, we'll see more and more ray mirror. And this is always going to be view dependent, so it's always going to be in relation to where the camera is looking. And let's go ahead and add in some Fresnel here. Now already in the render preview you can see what I'm talking about. We have our ray mirror setting at 1, which would normally produce 100% ray mirror with no diffuse shading at all. With a little bit of Fresnel applied, which remember is actually pronounced Fresnel, I just have the hardest time saying that, we see toward the view direction there some of our diffuse color and shading coming back. And as we turn this value up, it gets more and more pronounced. Let's raise this up to about 3. And we can reduce our ray mirror a little bit to let our diffuse color show through on the ray mirror areas a little better. And let's render this and see what we get. Okay, what do we have here? We have a nice pronounced spot here of diffuse shading and color showing through. And this is happening with the normals that are facing most directly the camera. Around the edges we have a very strong ray mirror effect, which is reflecting the surrounding scenery. Really nice. Because we reduce the ray mirror just a little bit, we have a slight green tint and a slight amount of diffuse shading, even on these areas that the Fresnel shader isn't touching. Let's see how this looks on Suzanne. I'm going to hide the sphere and cue Suzanne, and we'll need to link the material from our sphere back up to Suzanne. And I'm going to change the settings a little bit. I'm going to make the mirror color bright orange. I'm going to set ray mirror to full. And I'm going to set the Fresnel to about 2.5. Let's render that. Okay, when we're using a model with normals that are pointing in kind of different directions rather than the smooth normal interpolation of a sphere, the effect is a little different and a little more interesting. With our settings changes, we have a material on Suzanne that almost looks like a polished glazed ceramic. You might want to spend some time fiddling with the settings on your own. Try some different diffuse and specular shader types and experiment with the ray mirror's Fresnel settings. Now looking at the Suzanne model one more time, and let me collapse the edit cage on the subsurf modifier there. You can see that we have these kind of almost random normals. They're not really random, but they're definitely varied. And so this explains why we see our diffuse shader in most areas of the eye, but over here toward the edge, where the normals deflect away from the camera, we see more of our ray mirror. We get more of that effect over here in this other eye. We get a lot of that effect here on the ear. So once again, very interesting effects that you can achieve by combining the Fresnel shader with ray mirror right there in the mirror transparency panel. Okay, let's have a look at some ray transparency. I'm going to turn off ray mirror and I'm going to bring our sphere back. Now with ray transparency, instead of light reflecting off the surface of an object, it passes through, and it's influenced by the properties set in the ray transparency section of the mirror transparency tab here. Now ray transparency and Z transparency are mutually exclusive, and you can see if I activate one, the other turns off. Z transparency is fast but simple and uses the renderer's Z buffer to determine which objects should show through behind transparent ones. So with Z trans on, let me turn this alpha down some, and notice in the preview we can now see through our object to the background. Now alpha is a property of materials and textures that affect the transparency of an object or the pixels of the texture on an object. And we can lower alpha pretty far, and it gives a very ghostly effect to our transparent object. If I turn alpha all the way down, you can actually still see the specular highlights, but you don't see the rest of the diffuse shading whatsoever. This can be useful for some effects, but generally you'll want some diffuse shading in there. If we turn off both ray and Z transparency, our object will be transparent, but it'll cut through the whole scene and expose sky color. This can be a useful effect on occasion, but generally you'll want at least Z transparency active if you're using an alpha setting lower than 1. Now what you don't get with Z transparency is refractive effects. When light passes through certain transparent objects, it's bent or refracted. When we use Z transparency, we get see-through objects, but it's more of a ghosting look, and it doesn't distort the appearance of objects behind it. If you take a solid glass sphere or something out of your cupboard, say a drinking glass, you'll notice if you hold it up to the light that it bends and warps the light. You don't get that effect with Z transparency. You only get it with ray transparency. And when we activate ray transparency, we can mess with this index of refraction slider. Now our alpha is still at 0, and I'm going to turn index of refraction up just a tiny bit, 1.02. A little of this goes a long way. You can already see in our render preview the distortion of the image behind the transparent object. Let's go ahead and render that. Okay, look at that. We have 0 alpha, which means our object is completely transparent. No diffuse color whatsoever. And that tiny bit of index of refraction gives us the illusion that our eyes expect to see. We see this bending of the image behind the refracted transparency. And so whenever you're modeling see-through objects, you'll want to add some IOR to make it convincing if your object's supposed to be made of glass or lead crystal or something like that. Okay, let's look at some of the options for ray transparency. We already saw how index of refraction works, in that it distorts objects that appear behind our transparent object, simulating the bending of light that occurs in the physical world. Let's grab a quick look at depth. Now for transparency, the depth setting controls how many surfaces will be transparent if viewed through one another. You'll generally want this to be a little higher than the default if you're going to have either multiple transparent objects or a complex transparent object. Now let's look at the effects of this setting by way of demonstration. Okay, I'm going to hide the sphere. I'm going to activate this other layer with the transparency demonstration. And just like we did before, I'm going to select that camera and I'm going to control numpad 0 to make it active. And I'll select the first camera and hide it. Okay, what I have here is a little bit similar to the ray mirror demonstration, only these are all transparent panes. And I've already got the material applied. And let's start with a depth setting, a ray transparency depth setting of 0, and see what we get. Okay, notice that we can see through the first pane just fine, but all the rest of them are opaque. I'm going to bring our sphere back. And I'm going to turn the depth setting up to 1. And let's render again. Okay, this time we can see through an additional pane. We can see through these first two. And for a transparent sphere, we can see through part of it, but we still have this opaque spot. Now on the sphere, like on a lot of objects, you have the polygons in the front and you have the polygons in the back. Those count for 2 surfaces generally. So in this case we have a problem. We can see through a couple panes of glass, but we can't see through the final layer of our sphere there in the corner. Let's try setting a 3 and see what happens. I'll render again. Okay, great. We can see through our sphere again, just like we should. We can see through several of these panes, but we still can't see through to the back wall. So we'll just crank our setting up to 6, which should be just enough, and render one more time. Okay, now we can see right through all the panes, all the way to the back wall. We have just enough depth to see through all this number. If we were to add just one more plane to the stack, the last one would be opaque again, and we'd need to raise the depth. Now, if we activate Suzanne, we'll see some depth problems here too. Let me not forget to set our regular camera back as the active camera. Alt-H to unhide, and Control numpad 0 to set active. Now we'll take her depth all the way down to 0 and render. Okay, with the depth setting at 0, she looks rather strange. Only the frontmost faces are transparent and you can barely even tell. Suzanne represents a complex mesh in that there are several overlapping faces, so we'll need depth to compensate for all of that. Let's set depth to 1 and render again. Okay, with the depth setting of 1, she's mostly transparent, but there are still some opaque layers around the eyes here and the brow, most prominently. And it's hard to see here, but got a tiny little problem in the ear there. Raise it to 2, render again. Okay, with 2 we're almost there. She looks much better, but there are still some problems, especially in the brow area here. And we can raise this to 3, and that'll probably be just enough. Okay, 3 appears to be just enough, but be careful here, because if you're using a setting that's too low, or if you're using a setting that's just enough, and you're animating the camera at different angles, you're going to have different overlapping faces, so the depth requirement may change. So here you're going to want to make sure and use enough depth to get through all the layers. With a default setting of 2, models like this, you're generally going to have problems at the default setting, so you're going to need to raise them up. Okay, we're not going to be dealing with limit or fall off. You can experiment with those on your own and look them up in the Blender wiki. Just leave them at the default settings. Now the Fresnel settings here, see I said it right that time, are much like they were with Ray Mirror, with 2 exceptions. First, deceptively enough, the Fresnel settings here will work with Ray or Z transparency, or with neither. So remember, when you disable the Ray transparency button, if you have the Fresnel slider at anything above 0, it'll be influencing your material. In other words, turning this button off isn't enough to disable Fresnel. You'll need to set this to 0. Also, the transparency Fresnel effect works in opposite fashion to Ray Mirror, in that it exposes the diffuse shader effects around the edges of the view angle as opposed to in the middle. And let's see what that looks like. We'll need to turn our alpha back up, and we get a fully opaque material. even with ray transparency enabled, until we add some Fresnel here. Now look what happens. Now at the center of the view direction, we have transparency, and out toward the edges, we see our diffuse shader. And as I raise this up, the effect's more exaggerated. And let's render that. Okay, with our Fresnel turned way up, we're just barely seeing our diffuse color on these very extreme edges of the model. Just a little bit. That's probably too much for most purposes. But notice that the shadow here is also affected. So the Fresnel effect, the transparency, and the diffuse shader even affect the shadow here. And notice how much transparency we're getting even with our alpha maxed out. Our alpha's at 1, but because the Fresnel effect is bringing in the transparency toward the view direction, we're getting a lot of transparency. And I'm going to back this off a bit and go for a slightly more muted effect. And I'll render again. Okay, here we have a lot more diffuse shading and color, with the most transparent areas around the normals that face directly toward the camera. And of course the shadow's a lot darker too, because we have a lot more diffuse shader blocking the light. Okay, the specular transparency slider. This allows you to make specular highlights a little translucent, where they're normally opaque. And so you can play with this if you want less opacity on the specular highlights themselves, if you want them to be a little more transparent. Okay, and then there's the filter setting. Now this allows the diffuse color of the material to bleed in and influence the object. It doesn't allow any diffuse shading. So I'm going to turn Fresnel back up quite a bit here. And then I'm going to add some filter in. And look what happens in our render preview here. Our sphere is turning really green. We're not seeing any of the diffuse shading, but we're seeing plenty of the green diffuse color. Okay, so note what's happened here. We still have very little diffuse shading, but we've brought in diffuse coloring. Now this is kind of like setting the mirror color with the ray mirror effect, except we're using the diffuse color, and even the shadow here, notice, has taken on that green cast. So we got a nice green glass look. I mean, this isn't as beautiful as it could be. We're not going for beauty here, just demonstration. Let's look briefly at a few more settings that can influence ray tracing or other aspects of your scene. Back in the shaders panel, there are some buttons to the right of the shader selectors here. Let's look at just a few of them. Shadow. Now this is on by default, and for most circumstances it should be on. This determines if a material can receive shadows. If it's off, the material will not receive any shadow from other objects casting shadows. And generally you want that button on. Okay, transparent shadow. The transparent shadow button determines if a material that receives shadows can receive partially transparent shadows. So if you're wondering why you have alpha, if you have a transparent object like we have here, and your shadows are solid, it could be because transparent shadow's not on. And I think I have it on already on our background. Yeah, I have transparent shadow on, which is why you see the transparent shadow here. Okay, if the only shadow button is active, the surface won't render at all except for any shadows cast on it. Now I think I can demonstrate this really fast, even though it's not in the script. I'll select the background from the shaders tab, only shadow, and render. Let's see what happens. Okay, it's actually working. It's hard to tell, but behind these squares here is sky color. And so here you're seeing sky color with the shadow cast on it. These are all different materials. Let me select this other one. I'll select white. We'll turn on only shadow for that. You can already see it in the preview, and I'll render. Okay, and there you have it. You see sky color here. You see sky color here, except for there's shadow cast on top of it. Sky color here with shadow cast. So the object's not being rendered at all. Only the shadows being rendered, and that might come in handy for some types of effects. Let me just turn those back the way they were. Okay, down below here we have some sliders. Okay, the translucency slider determines how much diffuse shading occurs on the backside of lit faces. At 0, there's only shadows. And let's grab a closer look at Suzanne here. You can see on the backside here we have the diffuse shadows. Okay, look what happens there. The backside of the geometry that normally wouldn't be lit now acts as though it had its own light. So that's what translucency does. The ambient slider determines if your material receives any of the ambient light configured in the world settings. And if we go to the world settings here, you can set ambient light color. And then on a per material basis, you can determine how much of that ambient color your material receives. You can use this to color cast an entire scene, such as a night scene. If we were to turn our slider to blue, when we render, our scene will be blue. Let me just demonstrate that real fast. Turn ambient up to blue. And render. Okay, and here you can see with an ambient blue setting, everything receives a blue color cast. And on a per material basis, we can determine how much of that ambient color comes in with this slider here. Okay, and then we have the emit slider. This is normally used for radiosity rendering and surfaces that emit light. Even if you're not using radiosity rendering, you can still use this to brighten up a texture if you feel the need. Ramp shaders are not only powerful, they're very cool and fun to work with, and we want to spend a few minutes understanding how they work. Now you can create some great effects with these, such as materials that have different colors depending on the view angle. To turn on ramp shaders for your material, click the color band button in the ramps panel. And here you can actually see we have a ramp shader for the diffuse and a ramp shader for the specular. And we're just going to be working with the diffuse ramp shader. Now ramp shaders are called ramp shaders because they make use of this color ramp to map colors onto your diffuse shader. The shader will map the colors you specify in this ramp onto your material based on the information provided by the diffuse shader or your model's surface normals. Now looking at our sphere for a moment, and I'll turn this off for a minute. Look at what our diffuse shader is doing. We have this area of bright illumination, and it fades to dark. And as we've gone over before, this is a result of the diffuse shader interacting with the material. We can use the ramp shader to map the colors of our choice onto these light and dark areas. Now looking at the normals of our sphere, we can also use the ramp shader to map colors depending on our view angle to the sphere. Now just like with the Fresnel shader, how our view direction determine the effect, we can do the same thing with ramp shaders. We can map colors that are different based on the surface normals direction to the camera. Now if you're not familiar with Blender's color band widget, here's a quick rundown. You can select any of these interpolation points with a left mouse click, and you can drag them around. Right now there's just these two. When you select a point, you can change its color and its alpha right here. This interpolation point has alpha 0, and we can raise that to 1 if we want. If we select this interpolation point, we can now affect this color. We can add new interpolation points either with the Add button right here, or we can control-click anywhere on the color band. And it'll assign it the new color that was underneath the mouse when you click. So automatically this gets the color that was right in between here. You can delete any point by selecting it and then clicking the delete button. The ECLS buttons allow you to change the way that colors are interpolated between points. And we're just going to stick with L, which is linear. Now if you play around with this a little, you'll get the hang of it. And the same tool is used for procedural textures to map colors onto the gradients provided. Now when you activate this color band, you're telling Blender to map the colors you specify to the shading of your object. And so we turn it off, we see this green. That's our material color as we select it in the color here. Once we apply the color band, the diffuse color and shading are affected based on the way you configure this color band. Now how this is done, how these colors are replaced, is dependent on the input method. And there are 4 input methods listed here: shader, energy, normal, and result, and we'll get into those in just a minute. Now on the color band, the right side of the color band here represents the brightest areas of the shader. And the dark end, the left side of the color band here, represents the darkest areas of the shader. Now I'm going to change these colors around a little bit to help with the demonstration. I'm going to control click to add some points and change some colors so you can kind of see what's going on. Now for input mode, we're starting with shader. What this input type does is use the shading information for each light in the scene to map the colors of the color band onto your object, and take a look at what's happened. Now this is based on the diffuse shader, and it's based on the lighting. So what it's done is it's taken these bright areas of the diffuse shader where the normals are facing the light, and it's mapped this upper end of the color spectrum right onto it. And look what happens when we move the light. The ramp shader interpolates to follow it. Now something else to notice with the shader type here is that we still get diffuse shading. So the diffuse shading hasn't gone away. I mean, even if we were to brighten this color back here to say a bright red, even though the dark part of our color band is now bright red, you can barely see the red in the image here because the diffuse shading is actually still working on top of the ramp shader. That's what the shader type does. The ramp shader just replaces the diffuse color. So instead of seeing green here, we're seeing what the ramp shaders told us, and the lighting is still being applied on top of that. Another thing to note about the shader type is it works for every light in the scene. So if we duplicate this light, look at that, we get 2 ramps. Another thing to note is that the shader input type doesn't care about light intensity. It's going to map the ramp colors the same way whether we have a bright or a dim light. And I can grab this light and I can change its energy to 2. And notice that the whole scene brightens up, but the mapping hasn't changed. So the shader input type is taking information from the diffuse shader to map the colors, but it's still letting the lamp illuminate the object as normal. Now if we change this input type to energy, the result's going to be a little different. The energy type is like the shader type in that it uses information from the diffuse shader to calculate the color mapping. The difference is the energy input mode takes into account the intensity of the lighting when it's mapping the colors. And you can see our mapping's already changed. So this time, if we brighten our lamp, because the diffuse shader is much brighter, the energy input type has told the ramp shader to adjust the mapping. And as we make this brighter or dimmer, it's going to influence how our color ramp is mapped on. As with the shader type, the energy type applies its mapping before the lighting calculation is done, so we still get appropriate lighting on our object depending on whatever we set up. And like the shader type, the energy type gives us mapping for each light in the scene. Okay, let's look at the result type. Now the effect here is a little different. Result works after the lighting calculations are in, then applies its effect on top of the material and the shading. This differs from shader and energy types, which apply their effect before lighting is calculated. And also we can raise the value here, and it adjusts the mapping. But notice, no more diffuse lighting. The result shader has replaced all of that. So the areas that would normally be in shadow are replaced by red here. And we could really do the same thing here. We can create a dark color band down here. Actually, I'll slide that up a little bit. And so we have gradient mapping there. We have these spots in our dark spectrum and in our bright spectrum, depending on the brightness of the light. So remember, if you want the ramp shader to work over the lighting, use the result type. Otherwise, use either energy or shader. Now, one thing to note about the result type is because of the way it behaves, the way it ignores lighting, or rather it applies on top of lighting, result is what you want to use if you're doing toon shading, because it'll let you control how the shadows look, exactly how the shadows look. And so we could bring our shadows back. We'll get rid of that color band there. And we can bring our shading, our diffuse shading back, but we're doing it purely through the color band here. Okay, the fourth type of input mode is normal. Now this is a view-dependent shader type, so it ignores lighting, it ignores the diffuse shader in calculating the ramp, and it's only concerned with the position of the camera. So as I move the camera, as I move the view direction, the shader's changing to accommodate the view. Note that the normal input mode also is applied before lighting, so we still get our diffuse effects, and I'll demonstrate that by dragging red all the way down here and getting rid of the black one. And notice that our diffuse lighting is still affecting the shading there. But our camera, or our view direction, you can see that here in the preview, our view direction is determining how the mapping is applied. Anything that points directly at the camera, and there's our normals again, these normals here are going to be pointing at the camera. That's where the high end of the color band is applied. And for normals that are facing away perpendicularly from the camera, they're going to get the mapping from down here. And if we adjust our lamp a little bit, you can see that. There's our red. There's our red facing away from the camera, or perpendicular to the camera. Okay, what you can do with this is you can create materials that have a look that's different depending on their angle to the camera. So if we had basically a red material, and I'll get rid of most of these other points, we could have basically a red material that on its edges appears a lot brighter, say yellow or orange. And let's render that and see what we get. Okay, it looks like in our world settings, ambient lighting's still on, so I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to render again. Okay, now as you can tell, we have a nice material here that's very bright yellow toward the camera and falls off to red away from the camera. In the viewport, you can see this very readily again if we rotate the camera. So we move the camera around, look at how the color changes. So let's look at a quick example of simulating a metallic look using ramp shaders. I'm going to set up the color band using yellows, oranges, and browns, and I'm going to time lapse it. Okay, it's a little hard to tell with the sphere. Now let's get rid of the sphere and let's put Suzanne in. Now with the normal input type, once again we get a view-dependent look. So as we rotate our camera on Z, look at what happens to Suzanne there. Now that isn't the most beautiful metallic gold texture, or rather color ramp, but you get the idea. Could spend a little more time tweaking this and make it a lot more convincing. Even still, it's a relatively cool effect. Now if we go back in and we change our input type to something like shader as opposed to normal, instead of using the camera, it'll use the lights. Now the interesting thing about the ramp shader here is what it's really doing is it's replacing your diffuse color. So if we were to go over and turn ray mirror back on, maybe lower our ray mirror value just a little bit, and make sure we have plenty of Fresnel. If we were to render this, okay, look what we get there. We get our ray mirror effect around the edges because of the Fresnel effect, and in the middle here, facing the camera, what would normally be our diffuse color is instead our ramp shader. And so we got a rather interesting looking material. And for a final render, I'll turn the Hemi lamp back on. Turn our specular light back on. And I'll change our mirror color to something strange like blue. Give it a nice blue look. And let's render that and see what we get. Okay, not the most beautiful material, but definitely interesting. Now you want to spend some time with all these and you can create some amazing looking materials. I think you're probably starting to get the idea. You can also check out materials that others have made and how they made them to help you understand how certain looks are achieved. Be sure to check out the Blender Open Materials repository at blender-materials.org. Let's go ahead and take a very quick look at multiple material assignments. Now we're just going to do this down and dirty. I didn't prepare a script for this part of the tutorial, so apologies in advance if it's a little rough. But what I have here is a default cube. It has the default material assigned to it. And I'm going to tab into edit mode and switch to face select mode. Now what we want to do here is we want to assign a different material to each face on the cube. Now material assignments work as IDs. Each face can have a separate material ID, a number from 1 through whatever, assigned to it. And that material ID tells Blender which material to assign. Now by default, everything has a material ID of 1 assigned to it already. If we go over to the editing buttons, you'll notice a material ID widget here and some buttons that help us assign different materials and material IDs. So this is what you're going to want to use to assign multiple material IDs and multiple materials. Since we already have material ID 1 assigned to everything by default, I'm going to click the New button 5 more times. until we have a total of 6 material IDs. Now the widget lets you control which one is the current material ID. And you'll notice this number over here tells us how many material IDs are assigned, or how many material IDs are available, I should say. And this number over here tells us the current material ID. Over in the materials panel, we can also see that widget here. And we can see that Blender has gone ahead and it's assigned a material for each ID. Back in the editing buttons, we can select one face at a time and assign different IDs. These all have a value of 1 already, so we don't need to assign material ID 1. We'll go to 2 and we'll assign that. Now we'll leave this front face as material ID 1. We'll select that back face and we'll assign it material ID 2. So this button just assigned this material to the selected face. Select the left face and assign material ID 3. Go up one more, the right face, material ID 4. Material ID 5 we'll put on the top, assign, and on the bottom we'll assign material ID 6. Now once we have these assigned, we can verify which of these faces have which IDs. For instance, I can select all of these faces. I can select a material ID and I can hit deselect, and I can see that that ID is assigned to the left face over here. Additionally, I can have none of the faces selected. I can select a material ID and I can click the select button and it'll select the face that's assigned that material ID. So these tools can be handy for selecting and deselecting faces based on material ID assignment. I can also select a face and click the question mark icon, and it'll select for me which material ID is assigned to that face. So all these things can come in handy for dealing with material IDs. Okay, now that all these are assigned, let's go over to the materials panel. And we'll just start with the first one. We'll make this one red. We'll go to the second material and material ID. We'll make that yellow. We'll go to number 3. We'll make that green. Number 4. We'll make that cyan. Number 5. We'll make that blue. And number 6 will be magenta. Now as you can see, there are multiple materials assigned to our different faces. It's easy enough to do, and it just takes a little fiddling around with the widgets here and over here in the editing buttons. Now that we have all our materials assigned and colored, we can use the auto naming button to give each of them a name. And I'll start with the last one here and click on the auto naming button, and you'll see it assigns a name based on the color I have already chosen for it. I'll go back to number 5 and auto name that. It actually reads this as light blue. It's not exactly accurate, but hey, it's an auto name. Number 4 will auto name, names that deep sky blue. Number 3 is spring green. Number 2 is yellow. And number 1 auto names to red, just like we'd expect. So now we have all these materials, each assigned to its own face on the same cube. And if we want to change any of these, it's easy enough to tab into edit mode, select a face, select a material ID, and assign it to that new face. So there you have it. Multiple materials and material IDs. That brings us to the end of Blender Basics Part 5. This was a long beast of a tutorial, but I hope it gave you the information necessary to make exploring materials on your own not only possible, but rewarding. Come on by BlenderUnderground.com and let us know what you thought. And if you have any difficulty, post your questions on the Blender Underground user forums. This is Apollo signing off before the black helicopters of the man swoop in on us. See you next time.